What motorcycle culture really looked like in 1960s, Britain wasn't just about the bikes. It was about revolution on two wheels, where working-class kids transform themselves into leather-clad legends every weekend. Picture this. You're 17, you've saved every penny from your factory job, and you're about to join a movement that terrified your parents' generation. But here's what nobody tells you. The real story wasn't the violence and mayhem the newspapers screamed about. The truth is far more extraordinary. These weren't hooligans destroying Britain's moral fabric. They were inadvertently creating the blueprint for every youth subculture that followed, from punks to ravers, all while unknowingly documenting the death throes of Britain's motorcycle industry. Right then, let's dive into the meat of this story. The 1960s British motorcycle scene didn't just appear overnight like some mystical phenomenon. It grew from the ashes of post-war Britain, where rationing had finally ended and young people suddenly had something their parents never dreamed of: disposable income. The average manual worker in 1960 was earning about 14 quid a week, and for the first time in British history, he didn't have to hand it all over to his mum. A decent British bike on hire purchase could be yours for about £3 a week. Do the maths. That left you with enough for petrol, a leather jacket, and maybe a few pints at the weekend. This was revolutionary stuff. The motorcycle became more than transport. It was a passport to freedom. Your parents had grown up with bicycles and buses. You had a machine that could hit a ton. That magical 100 miles per hour that became the holy grail of every self-respecting rocker. The term ton-up boys wasn't just a nickname, it was a badge of honour earned by hitting that magic number, usually on the North Circular or the newly opened M1 motorway. Speaking of ton-up runs, stick around because I'm about to reveal which bikes actually killed more riders than any German bombing raid. And it's not the one you'd expect. The Café Racer wasn't originally about looking cool, though bloody hell they did look cool. It was about one thing: getting from cafe to cafe as fast as humanly possible. The most famous run was from the Ace Café on London's North Circular to the Busy Bee Café and back. The challenge? Complete it before the record on the jukebox finished playing. 3 minutes, give or take. 6 miles, in London traffic, at night, on 1960s, brakes and tyres. The bikes themselves were works of art born from necessity and poverty. You couldn't afford a proper racing bike, so you made one. Off came the mudguards. Who needs them when you're flying at 90 miles per hour? Handlebars were swapped for clip-ons, nicked from a crashed racing bike, or fashioned from plumbing supplies. Seats were chopped down to racing singles. Exhausts were drilled, baffles removed, straight-through pipes fitted. The neighbours hated you, but the sound... oh, the sound was glorious. The Triton was the ultimate café racer, a Triumph engine in a Norton featherbed frame. Why? Because Triumph made the fastest engines but handled like a shopping trolley full of bricks, while Norton's frame was sublime but their engines were agricultural. Some clever sod figured out you could mate the two and suddenly you had the perfect bike. Well, perfect if you ignored the fact that nothing quite lined up and the whole thing was held together with hope and electrical tape. Let me tell you something that'll shock you. In 1960, Britain was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. Not Japan, Britain. BSA alone was the world's biggest producer, churning out tens of thousands of bikes yearly. Norton, Triumph, Royal Enfield, Ariel, Velocette, Vincent. These weren't just brands, they were institutions. Every police force in the Commonwealth rode British bikes. Steve McQueen rode a Triumph in The Great Escape. Marlon Brando might have ridden a Harley in The Wild One, but real rebels rode British. But here's the controversial bit that the nostalgic documentaries won't tell you. British bikes were fundamentally flawed and everyone knew it. They leaked oil so consistently that riders joked it was a feature, not a bug. If it's not leaking, it's empty, they'd say. The electrics made by Lucas earned the company the nickname Prince of Darkness. Starting a cold British bike in winter required the patience of a saint and the kickstart leg strength of an Olympic weightlifter. The real killer, though, was arrogance. When Honda arrived at the Isle of Man TT in 1959, British manufacturers laughed. Tiny engines, weird styling, who would want that? By 1969, they weren't laughing anymore. They were going bankrupt. The Japanese bikes didn't leak, started first time every time, and here's the real kicker. They were faster. The Honda CB 750 arrived in 1969 and overnight made every British bike look like an antique. Now let's address the elephant in the room. The violence. If you believe the newspapers from the time, every bike meet was basically a medieval battle with chains and broken bottles. The mods and rockers clashes at Brighton, Margate and Hastings in 1964 were front-page news. Wild ones invade Seaside, screamed the headlines. The reality? Most of the riots involved more posturing than punching. One magistrate famously described the Brighton riot as nothing more than a few scuffles. But the myth was more powerful than the truth. The 59 Club, based at the Paddington Presbyterian Church Hall, had grown from its motorcycle section, founded by Father Bill Shergold in 1962, to reach 20,000 members by 1969. Think about that. A motorcycle club run by a vicar. Father Bill would hold services at midnight on Saturdays because that's when the rockers were around. He'd bless their bikes, and then they'd roar off into the night. Hardly the devils the Daily Mail made them out to be. The real clubs were more about belonging than violence. The Ace Café wasn't just a transport cafe, it was a church, a dating agency, a job centre, and a race paddock all rolled into one. You'd nurse a cup of tea for 3 hours, watching the gods arrive on their Vincents and Nortons, learning by osmosis how to fettle a carb or time a magneto. Before I reveal what really happened on those beaches, you need to understand the tribal psychology that made a bunch of kids willing to ride 70 miles in the rain just to have a scrap over music preferences. Drop a comment if you knew one of those kids. Here's something they don't put in the romantic remembrances. Riding in 1960s, Britain was absolutely lethal, and not just because of the ton-up runs. London still had proper smogs that could kill. In December 1962, a toxic fog descended on the capital that killed around 750 people. Imagine riding through that on a motorcycle, visibility down to 6 feet, no protective gear beyond a leather jacket, and a cork-lined pudding basin helmet. The bikes themselves were death traps by modern standards. Drum brakes that faded faster than a politician's promise. No indicators. You stuck your arm out and hoped. Tyres with the grip level of a buttered eel. No disc brakes until the very end of the decade. The Norton Commando, launched in 1968, was considered revolutionary because its frame didn't flex like a wet noodle at high speed. Think about that. Not flexing was the innovation. The statistics are sobering. In 1966, there were 1,400 motorcycle fatalities in Britain. To put that in perspective, that's more than double today's figure, with a fraction of the traffic. The average life expectancy of a dispatch rider was measured in months, not years. Insurance companies would simply refuse to cover anyone under 25 on anything over 250 cubic centimetres. Let's talk about the specific bikes that defined the era. The Triumph Bonneville T120, launched in 1959, was the bike everyone wanted. 650 cubic centimetres of parallel twin perfection. Well, perfection if you ignored the vibration that would loosen your fillings. It could hit 110 miles per hour, which in 1960 made you basically a test pilot. The BSA Gold Star was the Café Racer's weapon of choice, a genuine 100 mile per hour single-cylinder monster that sounded like thunder and handled like lightning. The problem? The valve gear needed constant adjustment. The magneto would die if you looked at it wrong, and kickstarting it required a PhD in mechanical engineering and the leg strength of a Tour de France cyclist. The Vincent Black Shadow was the Exotica, 1,000 cubic centimetres, 125 miles per hour, and a price tag that would buy you a small house. Only 1,700 were ever made before Vincent went bust in 1955, but they haunted every cafe through the 60s like ghosts of a more elegant age. Seeing one was like seeing a unicorn. But for every Bonneville, there was a BSA Bantam. a two-stroke horror that was allegedly based on a pre-war German design but somehow made worse. The Royal Enfield Crusader was another disaster, a bike so bad that dealers supposedly celebrated when they finally sold their last one. The Velocette Viceroy had an innovative but utterly terrible, infinitely variable transmission that worked perfectly right up until the moment it catastrophically didn't. You can't understand 60s bike culture without understanding that it was intrinsically linked to rock and roll. Not the Beatles, that was mod music, scooter music. Rockers listened to Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, and early Elvis. The jukebox at the Ace Café was the most important piece of machinery there after the bikes themselves. The leather jacket wasn't just protection, it was armour against society's disapproval. The perfect jacket was a Lewis Leathers Bronx or Lightning, festooned with badges, pins and painted slogans. Born to lose, live to win was popular, as was Mother cried when I was born. Shay knew. The studs and chains weren't originally for fighting. They were to stop the jacket flapping at speed. The look was specific and tribal. Jeans were Levi's, cuffed to show off engineer boots. White silk scarves weren't for warmth, but to stop the jacket collar chafing your neck on long rides. Hair was slicked back with brile cream, not for style, but to fit under a helmet. Every element had a practical origin that evolved into a statement. Here's something that often gets overlooked. Women were a huge part of the scene, not just as pillion passengers, but as riders themselves. The problem was that society, and particularly insurance companies, were having none of it. A woman trying to insure a 650 cubic centimetre Triumph in 1963 would face premiums 3 times higher than a man, if they could get coverage at all. But they persisted. Beryl Swain became the first woman to race a solo at the Isle of Man TT in 1962, finishing 22nd on a 50cc item. The bike had 2.5 horsepower. She averaged 48 miles per hour on the mountain course. That takes more courage than any ton-up run. The girl on the back wasn't just decoration either. She was navigator, mechanic's assistant, and often the voice of reason, preventing her boyfriend from attempting something monumentally stupid. The relationship dynamics were fascinating. These girls were choosing rebels over the safe office workers their parents preferred, but they were also the ones making sure those rebels survived to ride another day. By the end of the 60s, the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was in neon letters 50 feet high. The Honda CB 754 arrived in 1969 with an electric starter, disc brake, and 4 cylinders of smooth, oil-tight power. It cost the same as a Triumph Bonneville, but was better in every measurable way. British manufacturers responded by doing basically nothing. They kept building the same bikes with minor updates, believing that tradition and heritage would save them. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The rocker movement was already fragmenting. The younger kids were getting into progressive rock and growing their hair. The cafe racers were either settling down, moving up to cars, or dead. The Transport Act of 1968 introduced the first helmet laws. The romanticism of riding was being legislated away, one safety regulation at a time. The final nail came in 1971 when BSA announced trading losses of £3 million. Norton followed into receivership in 1975. By the decade's end, the British motorcycle industry existed only as badges owned by foreign companies. But here's the beautiful irony. The culture those kids created in the 60s is more alive today than ever. Modern cafe racers sell for 10 times what the original bikes cost. The Ace Café, demolished in 1969, was rebuilt and reopened in 2001 to massive fanfare. The Distinguished Gentleman's Ride, where thousands dress in period gear and ride vintage bikes for charity, happens in cities worldwide. Triumph, reborn under John Bloor in the 1980s, now makes bikes that capture the spirit of the 60s but actually work. The new Bonneville doesn't leak oil, starts every time, and has brakes that actually stop you. It's what those 60s riders thought they were buying, but better in every way. The ton-up boys didn't know they were making history. They just wanted to go fast, look cool, and stick 2 fingers up at authority. They created a template for youth rebellion that echoes through every subsequent generation. The motorcycles might have been British, but the attitude was universal. So there you have it, the real story of 1960s British motorcycle culture. It wasn't the violent anarchy the establishment feared or the golden age that nostalgia merchants sell. It was messier, more dangerous, more creative, and ultimately more influential than either narrative suggests. These weren't just kids on bikes. They were the first generation to realise that youth could be a lifestyle choice, not just a phase you grew out of. They took machines built for transportation and turned them into rolling sculptures. They created a visual language that still defines cool 60 years later. The British motorcycle industry might have died, but the culture it spawned is immortal. Every time someone takes a Harley and strips it down to its essentials, they're following a template created in a London transport cafe. Every leather jacket worn for style rather than protection carries DNA from the Ace Café. Every parent who panics when their kid buys a motorcycle is channeling fears first stoked on Brighton Beach in 1964. Those ton-up boys and cafe racers weren't trying to change the world. They just wanted to ride fast, live free, and maybe not die young, though the odds weren't great. Most of them, thankfully, survived. They lived long enough to see their rebellion become tradition, their innovations become classic, and their lifestyle become legend. So next time you see someone on a modern cafe racer, LED lights replacing Lucas Electrics, fuel injection replacing troublesome carbs, remember they're riding a dream first imagined by kids who just wanted to go faster than anyone thought sensible. Kids who proved that sometimes the best way to predict the future is to ride there at 100 miles an hour, hoping the brakes work when you arrive. If you enjoyed this blast through Britain's two-wheeled past, hit that subscribe button harder than a British bike hits the rev limiter. And remember, keep the shiny side up and the rubber side down unless you're trying to fix another bloody oil leak.